All right, I want to thank you all for coming the morning session of the second day of NDC Oslo. I imagine that most of you are probably tired either from the conference yesterday or what you did after the conference yesterday. So why don't you give yourself a round of applause and give a round of applause for all the people that are helping out with this conference, because this has been amazing for me as a speaker. So let's start off, let's get a really loud clap if you don't mind. It's 9 a.m. You can clap way louder than that, I know. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll be a bit more energized, because the topic at hand is something that gets me very, very excited, right? So usually when I do this talk, I have a little fun with the folks that are paying it or that are here. It's a little bit harder for this one because I cannot see anybody except for this gentleman this gentleman right here. So I do have stuff to give away. But before I do that, I want to introduce myself. So my name is Isaac Levin. I am a .NET enthusiast, Microsoft MVP, content creator, and I love .NET. I've been a .NET developer since college. That ages me. Most of the folks probably here are like, I started off with .NET 1.0. I have never touched .NET 1.0. 1.1, but not 1.0. If you want to learn more about me or some of the things that I do, I have a website and miscellaneous social medias. If you like listening to tech podcasts, I also have a tech podcast called Coffee and Open Source, where I talk with people all over the spectrum in tech. I've spoken with folks like Scott Hanselman and Kelsey Hightower, Martin Woodward from GitHub, and countless other people. I'm doing it for a handful of years, and I've had great conversations there. So if you like people ranting about tech, give that one a shot. And then obviously give me a follow on some of the different social medias. There's too many of them, honestly. I use Twitter the most, good, bad, or indifferent. So let's do this. I have who here can see the belt that I have on? So this is a .NET purple belt. I have 3 of them to give away. If you want them, you can choose not to. And I know that there's some people way in the back that I'm not going to be able to throw it to, so I'm not throwing them, period. This isn't a sporting event. But what I usually like to do is I like to have people raise their hand, and this is not going to work in this particular sense, but maybe just yell really loud. I'm going to start off with different versions of .NET Framework, starting with the newest version of .NET Framework, working all the way down to the less newer versions of .NET Framework. And if you're still actively maintaining projects that are on the lower version of the .NET Framework, you get this really cheesy purple belt. Does anybody want a purple belt? I'm guessing with the, is that a 9 a.m. thing, or is it these belts are not very stylish thing? 9 a.m. Yeah, these folks up here are very nice. They said 9 a.m. All right, so let's do this. So the latest version of .NET Framework is 4.8. So just yell or do whatever you want if you are maintaining actively a .NET 4.8 project. Yay! Yay. Well, congratulations, you have support. Everybody else who says yay does not have support. What about 4.7? Yay. 4.5? Oh, less yays. 4.0? Did actually somebody say yeah? Or just like, ugh. Huh? Yeah? Well, you, sir, or however you identify, there's a belt in it for you. So for the people that are 4.5, I have 2 more belts. Figure it out. They'll be up front. Be honest, people. But this gentleman up here, or however you identify, you get this one because I feel your pain and the rest of the people in the audience feel your pain. Can we get a round of applause for the guy who has to deal with 4.0 still? Yeah. I don't know if you're getting a theme, but I want people to clap because I want everybody else to be like, oh, that must have been a good session, I missed out. But let's get to the topic at hand. So before we talk about modernizing or upgrading our .NET Framework apps, let's talk about where we are today. Who here, and again, give me a yay or a however you want to do it, is actively building apps using the latest version of .NET, or modern .NET is how I call it, which is .NET 7 currently. Yay! Congratulations for progress. For the folks that haven't had the luxury yet, let's talk a little bit about why .NET 7 is so awesome. So a handful of years ago, the .NET team had a reimagining of what .NET could be. And there was a lot of reasons for that, and we'll talk about that as we go forward through this conversation. But most notably, they realized that it might be beneficial for all of us as developers to build apps that don't run just on Windows. And because of that, there's a lot of things that needed to happen. But most notably, they took additional steps to make the developer experience better by putting together a single SDK, one base class library or BCL, and a unified tool chain. Things like multiple versions of Visual Studio being able to be installed next to each other, multiple versions of .NET being able to be installed on each other, being able to build cross-platform native UI and web UI-based applications, things for the cloud, and all of this with a great developer story. Because at the end of the day, we're all developers, and if the tools suck, what happens? We leave, right? So you definitely want to make sure, if you're building frameworks and platforms, that the tooling and the experience for developers does not suck, right? Is that fair to say? Yeah? All right. So let's talk about how we got there. So folks probably are familiar with all three of these different frameworks on the left-hand side, but we'll go over them in a little detail. So .NET Framework, 20 plus years old, great experiences for that time, Windows only, the backbone of the enterprise, as folks like to call it. But there was a problem with .NET Framework. Most notably, .NET Framework only runs on Windows and is tied very, very deeply to IIS. So if you wanted to build applications that didn't run on Windows, you really didn't have an option. The community realized that. And some champions of the community started to build a .NIX implementation of C# and .NET. And that was called the Mono Runtime, and that was put together by some folks that eventually created a company called Xamarin. You might have heard of Xamarin. Microsoft also identified that the Mono Runtime was bringing amazing experiences to .NET developers and thought, hey, we might be in our best interest to do something like that. So they started to put together what eventually became .NET Core, which shipped, I think, 6 or 7 years ago now. I was at Build when they shipped 2.0, and that was like the, oh, it's ready now sort of release. And ever since then, we've been able to build amazing experiences with .NET all across the developer or the platform ecosystem. But what does this actually mean in the grand scheme of things? Because Microsoft eventually acquired some company called Xamarin. So they had, under their jurisdiction, quote unquote, 3 versions of .NET. .NET Framework, .NET Core, and the Mono Runtime. Even though the Mono Runtime is owned by the community technically, Microsoft is the primary steward of that framework. So do what any other tech company does, and let's just merge all of these things together and create one standardized approach. And let's just call it .NET. And we'll talk about some of the decisions as why that's interesting in a second. But at the end of the day, it's the best of .NET Framework, the best of the Mono Runtime, and the best of what we now call .NET Core. The Core has been dropped, and we have .NET starting in .NET 5, .NET 6, .NET 7, and .NET 8, which is going to come out in November of 2023. But what does this actually mean, right? There's 3 versions of .NET, or there's 3 versions of how you can build apps in C#, right? Long story short, if you're on the 4.8 version or the latest version of .NET Framework, no new features, no new things. I have a talk later today on Blazor. No Blazor, no cloud native, sexy bits, none of that stuff. Only security fixes, patches, things of that nature. So all of the things that you've probably seen yesterday and you'll see for the rest of this conference that are related to .NET do not come in Framework. But if you're on the latest version of .NET Framework, which is 4.8, you get support, which is the only thing that matters, right? And why, just somebody yell, why do you think we'll have .NET Framework support forever? Anybody? Because Microsoft loves legacy code. I don't know if that's 100% true, but .NET Framework ships in Windows. And as long as there's a Windows, there's going to be a .NET framework. So there we are. But that's what we talk about when we say .NET framework. It's no new features, only security and bug fixes, patches. So like I mentioned, there was a 1.0 and a 1.1 and 2.0 and so on and so forth of .NET Core. And then they got to version 3.1, which is the latest version of .NET Core 3, or .NET Core, under that particular name. And then the .NET team had an interesting dilemma. They wanted to rev the next version, but why is .NET Core 4.0 an interesting idea? What if we went to Google or Bing or however we search, is like, how do I wire up HTTP client with .NET 4? You're going to get things from the last few years, things from the last 15 years, and good luck trying to figure it out. So the team realized .NET Core 4.0 is not a great idea for a lot of reasons. Another thing they also realized is, hey, the model runtime has some really interesting characteristics that we should probably look to adapt to the proper framework. Ahead of time compiling, tree shaking, better performance. Let's take some of Mono and merge it up with .NET Core. And that's what they did. And because the idea of .NET Core 4.0 is a honestly not great idea, let's just drop the core nomenclature and go to 5. So going forward, it's just .NET. So that was .NET 5. That was shipped a handful of years ago. .NET 6, which was shipped in November of 2021. .NET 7, which was shipped in November of 2022. And .NET 8, which ships in November of 2023. The reason why I'm giving you these dates is it's very important from a support perspective what the dates and what the numbers mean. So if you have if you are building applications on an even version of .NET, that's 4, that's 6, and that's 8. You have long-term support, which means you have 3 years from the release date. .NET Framework 4 is a different story, but specifically for modern .NET, 6 and 8 will have 3 years of support. So, for instance, .NET 6, like I mentioned, shipped in November of 2021, 3 years of support. I went to high school and was really good at math. So 2021 or plus 3 is 2024. So that's when we'll run out of support for .NET 6. .NET 7 is an odd number version of .NET, and that is a standard term support STS version, which means you get 18 months of support. So as doing quick math, you can realize that .NET 7 is going to run out of support next May. But by that time, .NET 8 will be out, and the .NET team has done a large effort to make sure the upgrade story from modern versions of .NET to the next aren't painful. You need to make some modifications to your CS project, and you'll need to make some modifications to eliminate some deprecated APIs. But at the end of the day, the upgrade story is substantially easier than, say, going from .NET Framework to .NET Core or what have you. So the question then becomes, what is not in .NET 7? If you've been building apps for 20 years, more than likely some of the stuff that you build will not be available in .NET modern .NET. And most notably, the ones that I always call out is the third and fourth option in this table. Web forms and WCF. If you're building apps using those two app components or those types of models, give me a right? Rest assured, even though those technologies are never going to come or might not come in their current experience to modern versions of .NET, there are replacement options. Most notably, if you're building on web forms and you like the page controller sort of model, you can use ASP.NET Blazor. And if you want to learn more about Blazor, I have a talk later. There's some other people that have some great talks too. So if you don't like the way I talk, go to one of their talks if you want to learn more about Blazor. If you're building apps on WCF, you have a couple of options. You can go down the path of gRPC, which, if you're not familiar with gRPC, the RPC stands for Remote Procedure Call, and the G stands for literally nothing. because Google is fun like that. gRPC is interesting because it uses a different format to send data for web requests. When we build APIs, or in WCF, for instance, it's XML or potentially JSON based. And for gRPC, it's binary, which means that it can be up to 12 times faster to send requests and process requests with gRPC over WCF. So if you need more performance, maybe look at taking your WCF apps and migrating them over to gRPC. And there's great tooling in Visual Studio to do that. However, if you really, really, really love WCF and you love the way that you build apps there, there's a community-driven open source project called Core WCF, which Microsoft is one of the main contributors to. That is production ready. There's a 1.0 version of it. So you can rest assured that if you want a WCF builder experience, but you want to use .NET, modern .NET, give Core WCF a chance. Let's talk a little bit about, from a target framework perspective, what actually has changed going from .NET Framework to modern .NET. So if you have been a .NET Framework developer and you recently have gone, or maybe even in the last few years, started out with .NET Core and now .NET 5, 6, 7, previews in 8, you'll notice that the CS proj is a little bit different. One, you can open it in Visual Studio, so that's awesome. We should clap for that. The other thing is that the target frameworks, or the ways that the application gets built on that particular platform, is a bit different. So the .NET team decided to have a more simplified approach for these framework names. And the nomenclature is net x.y. X being the major release and Y being a minor release. So for instance, the latest version of .NET is .NET 7. So net 7.0 is that particular target framework. And that's code that runs anywhere. It runs on, Mac and Linux and Raspberry Pis, and if you have a Samsung television, it runs on your TV because you can run .NET apps on your TV, which tell me that's a great idea. I would love to see some really interesting examples of that, but you can. You can build them on Tizen. And what .NET 7 actually is it's the concatenation or the aggregation of everything that's in Net Core app, which was the target framework for .NET Core, and Net Standard, which is the target framework for .NET Standard. And we'll talk a little bit about what .NET Standard is in a moment. If you need specific platform functionality, like if you're running this on an Android phone or an iPhone or a Mac device or what have you, you can then add what's called a TFM, or a target framework moniker, after the target framework. And that's like, for instance, if you're in Windows, dash Windows, or dash Android, or dash iOS. And what doing that does is it lights up specific operating system or specific platform features. Does that make sense? Yeah? If it doesn't make sense, here's a little diagram basically summarizing what I just said. So that blue box, if you can't see that that's blue, the bottom box, netx.y, and that's the latest version of .NET Core, which is .NET Core 3.1, so Net Core App 3.1, and the latest version of .NET Standard, which is .NET Standard 2.1. And then if you need that specific OS level functionality, use the 4 boxes up at the top, or there's other options as well, and that is netx.y dash the device or the OS. All right. So if you're building apps, and they're, maybe some of them are cross-platform, some of them are modernized, some of them aren't modernized yet, if you're using packages or using libraries that have been built and maintained by Microsoft, what will those libraries target? So to summarize, anything that's cross-platform, aka like ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework, everything that's in like the system dot namespace, so system.link or system dot collection.generic or what have you, all of those are cross-platform, and those are targeted at .NET 7. If you need specific Windows functionality like WPF controls or WinForms controls, that is Net 7.0-Windows. If you still have other cross-platform exceptions, like maybe you're using Xamarin Essentials or Xamarin Forms or .NET MAUI, Net 7.0, with each additional TFM or moniker at the end of it is what you should be expected to target. And then finally, if you have an app or you're taking advantage of a library that's quote-unquote cross-platform for .NET Framework, which means basically it supports .NET Framework and supports .NET Modern or Modern.NET, that is .NET Standard 2.0. Clear as mud, right? Clear as mud. So the question then becomes, what should you, as a developer, target? So, if you're building apps today that need to have .NET Framework support as well as Modern.NET support, use .NET Standard 2.0. If you're not familiar with .NET Standard is a API specification or a contract for all of the namespaces and APIs the .NET team has built that we are dependent upon. Like I mentioned, that's SQL, that's collections.generic or system.link or all these sort of things. If you need to, for instance, build a library that's consumed by .NET Framework and Modern.NET, if you have that class library, if that's .NET Standard 2.0, it'll run on both of those different projects. And there are a few different versions of .NET Standard, so I'll go over this really quickly. The larger the number of the version of .NET Standard, the lower the more APIs you have access to, but the less platforms that you support. So here's an example. If you were to compare .NET Standard 1.6 with .NET Standard 2.0, 2.0 will support more APIs, but it'll support less things, like for instance maybe Windows 8 or older versions of the .NET Framework. So as you're building these libraries, as you're beginning your modernization story, take a look at some of the APIs you're referencing, take a look at the versions of some of the final projects that are consuming these libraries, and then make a decision there. If you're building apps in Xamarin or MAUI or using some parts of the Mono runtime, there are some additional APIs in .NET Standard 2.1, which is the latest and final version of .NET Standard, to potentially share code between those projects. But the number one thing is if you're building new greenfield apps, you're building new apps that don't have any dependency on .NET Framework, the class libraries can be .NET 7, the test projects can be .NET 7, the client projects, the web projects, what have you, those all can be .NET 7. So use .NET 7 in those particular cases. And I know what you're probably thinking, Isaac, you've been talking for 23 minutes, and the name of this talk is What Do I Do with My Old .NET Framework Apps? And you haven't done any of that. You've given us like a history lesson, and honestly, history wasn't my favorite subject, and can you move on, please? Let's talk a little bit about actually modernizing, right? So, there's a handful of folks here that are on versions of .NET Framework that are technically no longer supported. What do I do? Well, the first thing I say is get to the latest version by any means necessary. Because once you're on the latest version, you can honestly stay there. The one thing that I stress with people is that you don't have to be on the newest versions of .NET if you don't have to. Because the worst thing that you can do is take on the obligation of modernizing a project that doesn't need to be modernized and spend all that time and all that capital, and then your boss goes, well, what did we get from going from this to this? And you can say, oh, like it's faster. Oh, we can build apps in Blazor now. But the boss will say, but how much money does that mean? Because at the end of the day, it's all about making money, right? At least where I come from, all that matters is making money. So it's really important to think about, is it worth the investment of doing the modernization? And if it is, I like to lay out a particular workflow that folks can follow to make life a bit simpler. Let's not kid ourselves. Going from like .NET Framework 4.8 to .NET Core whatever or .NET 7, it's probably a bit horrifying to most of us, depending on the size of our project. So if we have a small project, probably not super terrifying. But if we have a project, I've talked to people that have 100+ .NET Framework projects. And like the thought of having to manually upgrade all of those projects, that's like months of work for multiple developers, right? So I'm going to go through a workflow of how we can make this experience a bit less painful. And the number one thing is be adequately prepared. Because at the end of the day, if we just start changing CS project files and we start changing our class libraries and we start, changing some of these things, we're going to really, really quickly run into a handful of problems. Like, oh, is this NuGet package? Do we need to upgrade? Do we need to find a different NuGet package? Because there's no version of this that's supported by .NET, modern.NET. So the number one thing that I will say is review your dependencies. There are some great tools for that. The .NET Upgrade Assistant, which is a CLI tool, or it's a Visual Studio extension, and I'll show you what those look like in a second. But building like a rich history or rich assessment of all of the front-end dependencies, all of the NuGet packages, all of the .NET APIs that we're taking advantage of, and just having an inventory of that is really, really valuable. Because once you get to that point, you might say, oh, this is way too much to do. Or you maybe could potentially say, oh, this isn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. And then that takes you to the second step, which there are a handful of tools, like I mentioned, the Upgrade Assistant is one of them, that you can begin the process of actually upgrading your project. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the things that we need to do from an upgrade perspective are quote-unquote boilerplate things. Oh, I need to migrate from this project structure to this project structure, or this NuGet package to this NuGet package, or so on and so forth. There are tools that can help you do that. So taking advantage of some of these tools might give us that leg up. And once we go through that upgrade, I can guarantee you your app will not build. Do not assume that you are done at step 2. So step 3 then becomes fix the code in Visual Studio or VS Code or Writer or what have you, and get to a point where you can run it in your own environment, you can run it locally, it builds successfully, you have warnings and errors and all that sort of stuff, and life is good. There's one important thing to call out. Don't do step 2 like in your main branch. Like, please, for the love of God, don't do that. Create a new branch, if you're using Team Foundation Server or TFC, create a new branch in that regard, and use that as a playground to experiment on actually modernizing. Because the last thing that you want is like, hey, can you add this new feature or fix this bug? Oh, I can't because main is completely broken right now. Like, what do you mean main is completely broken right now? That's not how it works. So do it in another branch, save future self problems in the future. Once you get to the point where step 3 is satisfied, then you can go on to step 4. You can run and test your projects locally. Make sure your test projects are the latest version of .NET as well, or else they're not going to work. Deploy to an environment that maybe you have a development environment or a staging environment or what have you. Maybe you can use some latest DevOps practices like blue-green deployments or what have you. And then at the end of the day, you're done. And it wasn't as bad as you probably thought it was. When you lay it all out like this, is it really as bad as we probably think about? Not really. But also, your mileage may vary. It could very well be like, step 1 is like 6 months. But if you have some tools in place, 6 months can turn to 3 months. And that's developer productivity, right? That makes your life a bit better. The question then becomes, when we're talking about step 3, is what do I rewrite versus what I reuse? Because at the end of the day, we are going to have to upgrade, or we're going to have to make some coding changes. There's no getting around that. You will have to write some code. So the question then becomes, okay, what can I actually reuse? And I'm here to tell you, most of it, more than likely. If you have any business logic, like conditionals or loops, if you are taking advantage of some identity stuff, like Microsoft identity stuff, if you're using dependency injections, some of those container configurations, like if you're using AutoMapper, those sort of things, third-party dependencies, like you're using Nunesoft.json or whatever. If you're building MVC apps, most of the model views and controllers are reusable. And what my recommendation is take all that reusable code and get it out of your your .NET Framework project. Create a new .NET Standard project, a class library, and start moving stuff into it. So when you're done with that effort, everything that's left in your your ASP.NET Web Forms project or your WCF project or what have you is only code that needs to get rewritten. And most of that code, honestly, is like ASP.NET startup code, things like configuration manager, if you're taking advantage of like HTTP modules, or some of the core principles like system.web in web forms, or some of the server WCF stuff. That stuff's going to have to get rewritten. But it's the only stuff that really needs to get rewritten. And you might be surprised, like, oh, it's really not that much code. It's way less code than I thought it was going to be. I have a solution with 40 projects in it, but like the actual code that needs to get rewritten is fairly minimal. Again, your mileage may vary. And some tools are here to help. For instance, I mentioned the .NET Upgrade Assistant, which there's 2 versions of it. There's a CLI tool that's been out for a couple of years, and there's an extension that has been launched into beta recently. It supports MVC, WinForms, WPF, console apps, class libraries. There's stories coming for other things as well, like Xamarin to Maui and some other things like that. The CLI tool has 2 functions, analyze and upgrade. Analyze is what you would expect. It builds you that assessment in a serif file, which is a format. There's VS Code's extensions for it, for instance, or there's individual viewers for it. So that analyzes all of your packages and then gives you a summary of what needs to change. And if you're satisfied with what you see in the analyze functionality, you can do the upgrade. And it'll take you through a guided experience in the command line to upgrade your apps from .NET Framework to modern.NET. And what it does is it uses Roslyn analyzers, and we'll talk a little bit about what Roslyn analyzers are in a second, that do a lot of the boilerplate, migration things that are very similar regardless of what your actual app does. But if you don't like the CLI, like I mentioned, there's a Visual Studio extension. And I stole these screenshots from the PM at Microsoft for the .NET Upgrade Assistant, Olia. So thank you, Olia, for making these available. Basically, you right-click on your project, and then you go through, and you can go through the upgrade process. And you have 3 options. In-place upgrade, which basically will rewrite the files that are in the project. There's a side-by-side, which will actually create a new project in that same solution that's modernized. And then there's the incremental side-by-side, which is a side-by-side, but it allows you to not do every single step of the process. Once you've decided on which approach you want to take, it then asks you what your preferred target framework is. And then it gives you options if you want the latest LTS, the latest STS, if you want to go to .NET Standard, those sort of things. And then it allows you to select what components that you want to upgrade. So literally checkboxes like I want this class and these dependencies in this project. And then finally, it gives you a report. Like, oh, 1 succeeded, X failed, some mods skipped. And at the end of it, those changes will be available in Visual Studio. So let's take a look at these 2 tools and see how they can help us as we modernize .NET apps. So the first one that I want to talk about is the CLI version of the Upgrade Assistant. So I have a WinForms .NET Framework 4.5 application open in VS Code. This project, it's a simple matching game. It's a silly example. There's nothing really crazy about it. There's 2 projects in the solution. One is a class library in .NET Framework, and one is a WinForms project in .NET Framework. And we can validate that by taking a look at the target framework here. Folks in the back, is this readable? Just say yeah or no. Okay, cool. All right. So as you can see, 4.5, that's the class library. And then for our console application, which is a WinForms app, also 4.5. So I'm not trying to fool you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the command line, and I'm going to start walking through the experience of using the CLI Upgrade Assistant to help us as we modernize. So let's do that. So I'm already in that project. So if you take a look here, let's actually get into where the source code is. As you can see, I have a solution, and that solution has 2 projects. Nothing super exciting, what have you. So what I can do is I can then go upgrade assistant, upgrade matchinggame.sln. So I can point the upgrade assistant, which is a .NET command line tool. It's a global tool that you can install. Point it at the solution, and then it'll start to begin that interactive experience. So let's do that. When I click that, it's going to do some telemetry stuff, and then it's going to start to load these extensions. So this laptop is probably freaking out because it's plugged in and whatever. So there we go. That uses MS Build behind the scenes to be able to do this particular task. So this is a Windows-only experience for right now. So the first thing that it is going to do is it's going to say, okay, select an entry point. Because you gave me a solution. We can't upgrade a solution, but we can upgrade individual projects. And then it'll ask you, okay, so select that entry point. So let's do option 1. And then it says, okay, pick which project you want. So let's go, okay, I want to upgrade my WinForms project. Let's do option 1. Then what it's going to do is, after I move forward, it's going to say, that might not be like the best idea. So if I select this project to upgrade, it's going to say, no, that's not really a good idea. Because this project makes reference to a class library, you should probably do the class library first. And if we remember our conversation earlier, if I was to upgrade the WinForms project first, it would not work. Because the WinForms project would be a .NET 7 project, and it would be using a .NET Framework class library. And as we all learned, that's not allowed. That class library needs to be .NET Standard. So it'll say, are you sure? Why don't you do the class library first? And I say, sure, I believe you, computer. And then what it's going to do is it's going to walk us through step by step of all the things that it's going to do for me in a guided experience. So the first thing that it's going to want to do is it's going to ask to back up your project. And I don't back up projects because I didn't listen to myself like 15 minutes ago say that we should definitely back up our projects or put them in another branch. I'm going to skip that. And then the next step is going to convert your project file to the new SDK style format. Because I remember we talked about how the fact that now you can open CS proj files in Visual Studio. And the reason why that is because there have been changes made to the structure of our CS project file that allow it now to be open in Visual Studio. So I'm going to say, okay, so let's do that. So it's going to convert that project file using try-convert, which is another tool. And it's going to convert it, and it's going to say it's successfully converted. And then if I open this up in Visual Studio, or Visual Studio Code, you're going to see that some changes have been made. Let's actually open this up so it shows up on both sides and get rid of all of these warnings. So on the left-hand side is what the CS project used to look like. As you can see, if I scroll down a little bit, 49 lines. The new version is 11. We're not done, so like this isn't going to work. But it shows you how simpler the structure of the new CS proj format is using .NET Core and modern.NET versus .NET Framework. So let's continue our modernization journey using the CLI tool. The next thing that it's going to want to ask is, do you want to run some code assessments or some assessments on your code, some analyzers on your code, to detect some of the things that you need to change? And I'm not connected to the internet, so this might be problematic. Give me 1 second. Lost connection to the internet between 5 minutes ago and just now. No internet. Now I'm connected. All right. So the first thing it's going to do, it's going to clean up your NuGet package references. And how it does that, it uses a Roslyn analyzer to run particular checks. So what Roslyn analyzers are, if you're not familiar, is it gives you the experience inside of Visual Studio or using the .NET CLI to actually run some repetitive tasks and run some repetitive checks. So what this does is it runs some target compatibility analyzers, Windows compatibility analyzers, things like that. And then the next thing it's going to want to do is it's going to want to update our TFM. So let's do that. So I upgrade my TFM, and it's going to identify what the TFM is for this project, or what it should be, and then it's going to start the path of upgrading. updated the TFM to .NET Standard, so that's applied successfully, and we can validate, if we scroll up, it was 4.5, and now it's .NET Standard 2.0. So let's keep going. The next step, okay, so let's actually run some more analyzers, because there might be some code that needs to get changed. There is some particular references to different packages that might need to get changed. Let's actually run those analyzers as well. So when we do that, in this particular case, because it's a class library, it's going to skip over these things because there are no particular checks that need to get made. And then we get all the way to the bottom really quick. Because this is a class library, there's no specific dependencies that need to get altered, so we can move on to the next project. So what we can actually do, after we select the next project, it'll give us a completed. And if we take a look here, whoops, on our left-hand side, still 49 lines, and there's 14 lines in the new version. And this is a fully functioning .NET Standard class library. It's pretty cool. So let's go on to our WinForms project. So let's do that. And the WinForms project, as you would expect, is a bit more complicated because there's some Windows dependencies, there are some changes to Windows that have happened in the last 20 years, rightfully so, so we'll need to accommodate those particular things. But the process is still the same. So it's going to ask if I want to back up my project. No, I don't back up projects. The next thing it's going to want to do is convert it to that SDK style. After we do that, we can actually take a look at what that looks like really quick. After it actually does it, all right. So then we open up VS Code again. We can open up our particular project. And for the .NET Framework, the older style, it was 89 lines, and now the new one is 16. However, again, as we learned earlier, that's not going to work, so let's continue our journey. Same thing, going to run those analyzers, but these particular analyzers, because we have things in Windows, there might need to be some additional things that we need to change. Windows has added new functionality, new requirements even, for people who build client applications using .NET. For instance, you need to have apps that support high DPI, because high DPI is now a thing in latest versions of Windows. So it runs those analyzers, and the next thing is update those TFMs again. So in this particular case, it recommends the TFM as .NET 7.0-Windows. We saw that earlier, right? So it identifies the WinForms project and says, okay. So the next thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take that .NET Framework 4.5 target framework and now make it .NET 7-Windows. And after it does that, we can validate by scrolling up, .NET 7-Windows, and this is 4.5 on the other side. And then we're going to then run a Windows compatibility analyzer. And like I mentioned, there are some changes that have been made to Windows in the last 20 years that we need to accommodate, right? So let's do those things. And it's going to actually identify maybe potentially some coding changes that need to get made in this particular case. So let's take a look at what those potentially be. So it skips over the fact it's not a WCF service. It identifies that it's a Windows desktop project, so we need to do things like setting the new default font API alert. And then it's going to ask to provide a WinForms source updater. And then finally, if you look at step 10, if you're skipping ahead, you'll see that it says update source code, which, I mean, whenever I see a computer say, hey, update source code, I'm like, is this computer going to do exactly what I want it to do? In this particular case, yes, because these analyzers that are running, they know particular things that have to be added to new projects. So if I skip over that, go to the next one, finally get down to our last step, which is updating that source code as I mentioned, and it completes it, right? So we can move on to the next project, and it says, oh, finalize your upgrade. And look at that, we are done. So what actually was changed? So if we take a look here, our CS project now, it's 20 lines. It's a .NET 7.0-Windows project. It references a class library, which is in .NET Standard, and it made some coding changes. One line specifically, and that is adding high DPI mode, system.aware, because that's a requirement for latest versions of Windows. So here is the final test, right? So if I go into this particular project and I just do .NET run, which is the command line based tool that's available in modern versions of .NET to run the application, what's going to happen, do you think? Do you think I'm going to get like a bunch of horrible error messages, or do you think it's actually going to work? Nobody has faith. People are like, I don't know, you did it like on stage, dude. Like, this is going to fail miserably. So if I run .NET Run, hopefully my little matching game will open up. Oh, registry does not exist. Oh, that's because when I put together this demo a bit earlier, I forgot to comment out the registry part of this project. So if I do that, I can do that right here. Because this app used to store stuff into the registry, it's a better approach to do that somewhere else. But if I comment out this, and I do .NET Run again, maybe it works, maybe it fails again, because that's life. And it runs. So I took, in the matter of a few minutes, I took a .NET Framework 4.5 app, and I converted it or upgraded it to .NET 7, and it works, right? Like, this is just a silly matching game, right? Nothing really exciting. Sometimes I get one. Oh, I got one. Yay! But again, very simple example, but it shows you what you can do. Let's look at another example using another tool. So let's close out of this, close out of that, and I'm going to go, not into demo, I'm going to go into everybody's favorite environment, Visual Studio. Who here uses Newtonsoft.json? I can't tell who's raising their hand, but I'm going to say everybody. If you're not familiar with Newtonsoft.json, it's like, if it's not the number one, it's top 3 most downloaded NuGet packages. It basically allows a mechanism for you to deserialize and serialize JSON. That's oversimplifying what it does, but it's what primarily it's used for. So I found an older version of Newtonsoft.json, most particularly a .NET Framework version of Newtonsoft.json, a 4.5 version of Newtonsoft.json. And what I want to do for you folks is I want to take this class library and upgrade it to the newest versions of .NET using the .NET Upgrade Assistant. And how I can do that, let's just close out of here. Right-click on the project, go to Upgrade. So as you can see, it says Upgrade right here. If you have the extension installed, which I believe in the later versions of Visual Studio it's pre-installed, you right-click on your project, there'll be an Upgrade option. You click that, and then it's going to spin up that interface like I mentioned a bit earlier. So you have that option for in-place or side-by-side or side-by-side incremental. Let's just do side-by-side. And it says, okay, so what is your upgrade target? I want to create a new project in the same solution. I want to call it Newtonsoft.json core because I'm boring. So let's click Next. And that's going to ask me what's my preferred target. I can do .NET 6, .NET 7, .NET 8, .NET Standard. Let's just go the latest version of LTS, which is .NET 6. Click Next. And then it's going to specify what components you want to upgrade. I want to upgrade all these components, obviously, because I want this project to be fully converted. I click Upgrade, and then it's going to actually go through this process of upgrading all of those classes, that project, to .NET 6. And then, hopefully, if everything works, I'm going to create a client project, like a console app, that makes reference to this new project and see if it actually works for me. Hopefully this doesn't take a long time. My laptop, I can hear it right now, which is never good. But as you can see, it starts to actually go through the process of iterating over all the files in this project, and it starts to upgrade them if it needs to. So in this particular case, there's 224 files in this particular project, and as we go through, there's about half of them. And again, like, I don't need to do everything at once. I can individually specify individual classes that I want to upgrade, or individual projects that I want to upgrade, or individual dependencies. But as you can see here, it says 12 succeeded and 212 skipped. So 12 files in this particular project needed to be upgraded to .NET 6. And 212 are just taking advantage of existing APIs that have not changed. All right. And then if I look, scroll up, if I look in my project now, and let's actually unload this project, I now have a Newtonsoft.json core project, which, if you look, it target frameworks .NET 6. So that's pretty cool. So let's actually create a new project. Let's create a new project. Clicked it on the wrong area, at the solution level, not the project level. So add, new project. Hopefully creating a new project doesn't take forever. I updated Visual Studio today. That was a terrible idea. And Windows, also a terrible idea. All right. So when this comes up, I'm going to open up, I'm going to select the project template for a console app. If you haven't built a console app, and let's just call this test JSON, and I'm going to use .NET 6, which is the long-term support. And if you haven't built a modern .NET application and you create a new template, this is what you get for a console app. That's it. No curly braces, no system main, none of that stuff, because there's a new minimal approach to building .NET apps. And I believe there's a talk here, I can't remember the speaker, that talks about some of the new changes that are available for the latest versions of C# and .NET. So check that out if it is today or tomorrow. If it was yesterday, you missed out, unless you went to it and then whatever. So let's actually do a very quick demo of testing out this particular upgrade that I did. So I'm going to create a new list, and that list is just a new list of string. And in there is hello and NDC, right? So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to serialize that class or that object that I've just instantiated, that I've just created. I'm going to serialize into JSON. And how I do that with Newtonsoft.json is I use JSON convert. So I'm going to create a new variable called JSON, and that's going to take advantage. Actually, before I do that, let's make sure that I'm referencing that in here, because sometimes Visual Studio says I can't find this project. So if I right-click on that, specify that, click OK, and then I go JSON convert, serialize object list. IntelliCode helps me out there, and then I control dot, and then I add that Newtonsoft.json namespace to there. And then what I want to do is I just want to console.writeLine JSON, and then, and then just for grins, let's just create a new list. Oh man, typing is failing today. Var list2, and let's just test out deserializing. So that's JSON convert dot deserialize object, and that's list of string JSON. And let's just do console.readline just so it doesn't close out. So if I run this, let's just make sure that I have the right project selected. Test.json, set as my startup project, save everything. If I run this, hopefully if I didn't mess everything up like I did earlier, I should get a console window popping open, and what it'll do is it'll write out the serialized version of this list of strings out to the console. Again, very simple example. I get a build error because, of course, I get a build error. And the build error that I get is no target frameworks were selected, no identity platform. I don't know what that is. Let's try something. Let's try this. Let's do this. Let's just get rid of these property groups because I don't know what they do. And I see that they have .NET Framework in them. Let's try that now. Hopefully, aha, that's what the problem was. So this should pop open, like I mentioned, just that list of strings serialized as JSON. Again, very simple sample that shows that with some tools, you can go from .NET Framework to the modern versions of .NET, and you don't have to do it all yourself. That's the number one thing that I want to stress throughout this, is that we don't have to do everything ourselves. And with that, I want to thank you for joining. If you go to that link right there, isaac.dev/.NET-upgrade, there'll be a link to the slide deck, a link to some really valuable documentation about modernizing. It'll also be, I believe that there's links to the different tools that I showed, so the upgrade system for the CLI as well as the extension. And yeah, thank you so much for hanging out with me at 9 a.m., day 2 of NDC Oslo. This has been great. I want to thank you so much for your time. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of the conference, and take care. Thank you so much.